everyone, it's Dave Bredhauer. I'm going to use the Fishtails Clear Stamp Set today, along with some Distress Oxide inks to create some fabulous underwater cards. I'm going to use the Misty Stamp Positioning tool to put my images in just the right spot. I'll place the fish so it looks like they're hovering sort of middle of the card, and I want to make it so that some of them are on the card and some are halfway off the card, so that there's a little bit of dimension as you're building the scene. Once you are satisfied with the placement of the fish, simply close the lid of the Misty and pick up the clear stamp images. I plan on embossing these images, so I'm going to use a black pigment ink to ink these clear stamps. Carefully press the ink pad along each of the clear stamp images until you have ink over everything. I've stamped the image twice to ensure a nice, rich black image, which will be ideal for embossing. Remove the card from the Misty and get ready to emboss. You'll want to apply the embossing powder while the image is still wet, so make sure that you have this nearby so you can scoop it onto the image and get it to stick before any of the ink begins to dry out. This is an iridescent embossing powder by Judikins that's heat reactive. At first, it melts like normal embossing powder, but the longer that you hold your heat gun on the embossing powder, it begins to shift color slightly in the iridescent range. You can see here how there's a bit of a rainbow effect depending on how long I held the heat in different portions of the image. When it first begins to melt, it turns blue, and then if you hold the heat source on the image a little bit longer, it changes to green, then yellow, then orange, then red. And now comes my favorite part. I've sped up the video here so you can see all the detail that goes into adding color to these fish. I've chosen a simple, bright colored palette of Copic markers, and my only rule is that I want each color to be balanced across the card. So for example, as I have the yellow in my hand, I'll put some yellow on the bottom fish, some yellow on the top fish, and then move across the card so that there's a little bit of yellow everywhere. Continue doing this until all portions of the card are filled in. Now that I've colored in all of the images, I'm going to apply a layer of clear glitter glue, in this case diamond stickles, to each fish. I'll squeeze a little bit on, and then using the tip of the applicator bottle, I'll spread the glitter glue in a circular motion on each image. I start at the edges and then work my way out to each of the images. Once you've filled in all of the fish, you'll need to allow this time to dry. Depending on your work area, this can take from 20 minutes up to an hour, so plan ahead. I wanted the fish to sparkle as much as possible and catch all the light from different angles, so the combination of the glitter glue plus the iridescent embossing powder really makes these fish shine. Now make sure everything is dry before you begin the next step. I'm going to use glossy accents to create a layer of glaze over each fish. Once you get the glossy accents moving, start by adding a layer of glossy accents right along the perimeter of each fish, almost like you're frosting a cookie. Just trace along the outside line and then use a circular motion and a gentle squeezing pressure to fill the interior in. As you press and squeeze, the liquid will self-level and flatten out, and then once it's dry, it'll be perfectly smooth. You'll need a good amount of time for this to dry well. I let mine dry for 4 hours before moving on to the next step. I'm going to use Distress Oxide ink to create an underwater background around the fish. Since the fish are covered in glaze, they're naturally going to repel any ink that I put on them, and any excess ink will come off later with a washcloth. I'll begin with cracked pistachio, just rubbing it along here and there over the fish and on the edges of the card. I'll follow that up with a layer of Distress Oxide ink in broken china. I want to make sure I'm overlapping areas so that colors blend together naturally. I'm trying to create a greeting card with lots of vivid color, so I want to fill in every single space that I can, but I'll do this step by step. To make it look like there's a little bit of sunlight coming in at the top of the water, I'm going to use plain old Distress ink and squeeze lemonade to add just a touch of yellow at the top so that it looks like light is filtering down into the water. Next, Distressed Oxide ink in Faded Jeans is applied at the bottom and around the edges, and overall just to give it a little bit more depth. Once I've finished applying this color, I'm going to look at the card and look for any weak areas in the picture. I'll apply some more of the Distress Oxide ink in broken china to fill in those weak spots. I'm going to go over a little bit of that yellow area, but be careful not to completely change it to a different color. And finally, add some of that Distress Oxide and cracked pistachio to fill in any last layers. I want a nice even tone over the whole card with lots of rich color. Now you'll notice that those glossy accent areas are getting hazier and hazier, but don't worry, a dry washcloth will clean it right up and make them vivid again. I'll add some water droplets to the background, sprinkled here and there, to make it look like bubbles in the ocean. It's a great look, and Distress Oxide ink is just perfect for this technique. I want to stamp a sentiment on this card from the fish set, but I want it to stand out, so I'm using an Open Studio set called Stitched Circle Layers to create a layer that says Sending Birthday Fishes. It's got a nice little stitching detail around the edge of the circle, and it works great in the middle of all those bubbles. Once everything's dry, go ahead and glue it onto the card and you're all done. This last card is quick and simple. It gets sort of the same look as the other card, but skips the glitter and glossy accents techniques. For this time, you'll begin by putting the Distress Oxide ink down first. We're going to apply some of the broken china here and there around the card, sticking pretty much to the middle. You'll switch to cracked pistachio, filling in and overlapping the layers of the first color. As you add the color and overlap, it'll create new layers and make the color vivid in some spots and lighter in other spots. I want to add some fossilized amber, just a nice bright spot, again trying to give the idea of some light coming into the picture. Now add some water droplets and set that aside to dry for the next part. Once the droplets have dried out, I'm going to put that card on my MISTI stamping tool, hold it down with a magnet, and start positioning my images. Now these images are from the Fishtails Shadow set. The Shadow set and the Fishtails set work together to layer and make interesting combinations. I'm putting all the shadows down first, closing the lid, and then using a different color of ink for each one of those 4 fish images. For the largest fish, I'm going to ink it up with Distress Oxide ink in Iced Spruce. I'll use Distress Oxide ink in Broken China for the next fish, and for the third fish, I'm going to use Distress Oxide ink in Cracked Pistachio. For the last fish, I'll use Spiced Marmalade, being careful to not hit any of the other fish while I'm inking this one up. Now don't worry if you don't get everything inked perfectly. Remember, with the MISTI stamping tool, you can just ink it again, stamp it again, and everything will fill in fine. So I've closed the lid and I've pressed it out, and I've stamped it, and you can see that there's some areas that didn't stamp out quite right. But no worries, I'm just going to ink it again, and we'll send it through one more time, stamping it so that it gets a nice solid image. Plus, since we are stamping on an inked background, you do want to stamp it a couple times so that the image is nice and rich and really shows up against those background colors. Now, keep that card in place inside your MISTI. Begin putting all the images from the fishtails set, in this case all the outlines, over those solid areas. I don't mind if the registration's a little off here. The images are a little bit whimsical, and it just kind of makes everything look a little bit more playful if the color's a little bit different from where the outline is. Now, I wanted to skip all the glitter that I used on the first card, but I wanted to spruce things up, and I think adding some white details from a white pen makes things look a little less flat. So I've simply added some dots on the scales and on the tails of these fish just to brighten things up a little bit. And I think it complements nicely with all the bubbles from the background with the distress layer technique. Add your sentiment with the MISTI stamping tool or with a clear block and you're all finished. I hope you've enjoyed these cards, and I encourage you to go try out these techniques.